Okay, I see people filtering into the chat. So everyone, welcome. Thank you for being here. We're going to get started in just another moment. Give people just another minute to get in, but there is plenty we can be talking about, so I'm gonna keep things as timely as I can. And all right, I am gonna get things going. Well, everyone, hello. Welcome to this first edition of the MIT Free Speech Alliance's Summer Sessions webinars. My name is Peter Bonilla. I am the Executive Director of the MIT Free Speech Alliance. For those friends and members of ours who are tuning in, thank you for joining. For those who might be new to the MIT Free Speech Alliance, welcome. We're very glad to have you here. And we would love to have you as one of our members, even if you aren't yourself an MIT graduate or faculty or staff member. We are an alumni organization with about 1,250 members. Our mission is to preserve and protect and advocate for free speech, academic freedom, viewpoint diversity, and open scientific inquiry in MIT and in higher education at large. We're very happy for your support. Membership is free. I will drop a link to our website in the chat. You can also read our Substack, which we post to weekly, and where the top entry is a discussion of the book whose author we are meeting with today. So I am very happy to introduce Adam Szetela. Adam is the author of That Book is Dangerous: How Moral Panic, Social Media, and the Culture Wars Are Remaking Publishing. It is out from the MIT Press, just out in paperback, I believe. Excellent book from a great press. I encourage everyone to pick it up. Adam earned his PhD in English from the Department of Literatures at Cornell University. In addition to his publication of That Book is Dangerous, he has written for outlets including The Washington Post, The Guardian, and Newsweek. We are very happy to have him with us today. So, Adam, welcome from the MIT Free Speech Alliance.
Excited to be here, Peter. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So what I'll start out with today, and before I get too far in, Adam and I will hopefully keep about half of this to our own discussion and back and forth, and keep the rest for questions from the rest of our attendees. So if you have questions as we are going along, please feel free to drop them into the chat, and we will keep an eye on them for when Q&A time comes around. Um, so first, Adam, what I would like to start with is kind of what got you to the process of writing That Book is Dangerous. If you don't mind walking me through it, could you talk a little bit about how, first of all, what you were doing before you came to Cornell, before you put your efforts into this book, what ignited your interest in the topic, and kind of, for everything that has been said about the publishing industry, including the young adult publishing division, which I know has been commented on and remarked about by many over the years. How did you become, in the midst of all that, the guy to write this book on the industry?
Yeah, those are great questions. So I would say in roughly the mid 2010s. So I had already gotten an MA in English in my early 20s. I was in my mid 20s around 2015. I was just adjuncting. I knew I wanted to go back to school and get a PhD at some point, but I was just adjuncting, writing academic work as well as more journalistic work. And around this time, I noticed that in the periodicals that I was reading, places like the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Guardian, the Atlantic, so on and so forth, I was increasingly coming across articles about books that had been canceled. And I don't use that term in a metaphorical way or even a political way. I mean, literally canceled. So you'd be reading the Washington Post, and there's a story about a picture book that was supposed to come out, and it got accused of racism. And Penguin Random House or Simon and Schuster was saying, we're gonna postpone the publication date, or we're gonna cancel the publication date. Advanced reading copies had gone out, and people are saying this book is problematic. So I really started noticing it with children's and young adult literature. So young adult, you can define it a few different ways. Generally, they're talking about teenagers, sort of preteens, fiction. And at a certain point, though, I was seeing this also with adult nonfiction and adult fiction. So it was the same sort of accusations that I was already seeing at leveled at picture books, at YA, which were alarming in and of themselves. But it was increasingly seeing, oh, adult novel supposed to come out accused of sexism or misogyny or transphobia. Um, and basically, the question I had started sort of just taking notes on and thinking about to myself, which was if this is what I'm aware of as someone who does not work in publishing, then surely this climate of canceled books has to be shaping things behind closed doors. And it was right around this time that I had applied to PhD programs. I ended up starting at Cornell in 2020. And I was very fortunate, despite the various free speech and academic freedom issues that Cornell has, I was able to sort of carve out my own space of supportive professors and, sort of tucked away in the middle of nowhere in Ithaca. And I really just used my time at Cornell to research this topic extensively. And I really wanted to answer my own question, which was, again, if this is what I know about as someone who has never had a job in publishing, then what's going on behind closed doors? So I spent a few years interviewing people really in all corners of American publishing. And when I mean that, I mean everyone from like a literal intern to someone who is a president or a vice president of an imprint at a big five publisher, a place like Penguin or Simon. And basically I got regaled with sort of countless stories about how, whether you call it cancel culture or wokeness or what have you, how this has really penetrated every level, from how books are marketed to the public to acquisitions policies to editorial policies. Um, and the unifying theme of this is all, I would defend the word censorship. It's all censorship happening in the name of progressive values, almost exclusively directed at progressives themselves. So when you read about, in my book, a novel being canceled, a picture book being canceled, peer-reviewed journal article coming under fire, there are occasional moments where it's like a Mike Pence memoir or a Jordan Peterson. But for the most part, this is almost entirely progressive authors trying to write progressive books who get called out on social media for essentially not being progressive enough, and the publishers, in many instances, taking action. So action in the sense of books supposed to come out, we're going to cancel it. Books supposed to come out, we're going to delay publication date. We're going to send it to people who can sort of like edit away the alleged racism or sexism or what have you. Book already came out. Folks are going to organize a petition on change.org to get eBay or Amazon or Barnes and Noble to not sell the book. The examples were really countless. And, my book came out last August, and, it's not, you can talk more about this at some point in the conversation, but it's not like this sort of just disappeared. It's still very much a part of publishing, and I get emails with regularity from people both in publishing and people who are trying to get representation and stuff with their own sort of horror stories of this.
Sure. Well, we're definitely we'll definitely get to the question of how much of a factor it remains because uh yeah, a lot has changed nationally, politically, um, in around the United States, far outside of publishing. And I do have some questions about that, but we'll get there. But one, I'd like to talk a little bit more about your time at Cornell, which I'm interested to hear about because a doctoral program in English doesn't seem like to most people like the kind of place that would serve as the petri dish that can produce a book of popular interest. on the publishing industry like this. And one thing I was really curious to hear more about, and which I think our listeners would be interested to know more about as well, are some of the studies that you did with Cornell's Social Dynamics Lab, where you tested the priming effects on certain phrases on young readers. I might be getting it a
Sure.
little bit wrong there, but could you talk a little bit about that kind of research that you put in?
Yeah, so for context, it's without exaggeration when I say I was the least liked person in the Cornell English department. Before I was at Cornell as a fellow at Harvard for a year, I would say I was probably one of the least liked people there as well. Um, there's a few different reasons for that. One is clearly my openness to ideas that are considered politically taboo or what have you on an Ivy League campus. Another part, I'm pretty direct and outspoken in terms of how I communicate. But to your question, another part is I don't do the kind of research that's typical of an English department. So I have been admitted to top programs in sociology. I was very much on the fence about like where I wanted to do my doctoral work. I greatly value empirical research, which is it's almost like a slur in an English department. I can think of so few even top English scholars who do anything that's falsifiable or empirical or what have you. A lot of it just reads like glorified opinion in my personal opinion. But anyways, when I got to Cornell, I was very privileged. I was doing my graduate coursework in sociology and psychology. I was making friends with folks who are really high level quantitative researchers and experimentalists. And for this book, there were certain questions that I wanted to explore that I needed, more social science methods, right? So one of them, the sort of reigning question with all these controversies is to what extent do people even believe the accusations that they themselves are leveling at books? And to what extent is this sort of like a kind of mob mentality, a certain kind of fitting in, especially a kind of fitting in that I have come to see as very common among the highly educated, left leaning liberal class who spends an inordinate amount of time online.
Performative.
And definitely performative. I think practically functional in some ways, right? So like, I don't know if the hashtag is still being used. But there was a period where the hashtag silence equals violence was the hashtag. So it was like if you also are not tweeting about how bad Gino Diaz is or how bad Peterson is, then you yourself are an enabler, a white person sympathizer, what have you. So long story short, I got together with two folks in the sociology department. Two folks are really smart experimentalists and quantitative researchers. So Michael Macy, who's a professor there, Shiyuji, who's one PhD student. And we worked together on a project where we recruited hundreds of people, so non-students, in a sample that was roughly approximate with US demographics. And the design was, I'll give you like sort of the Spark Notes version of it. So we had a group of hundreds of readers, and we gave these readers a sample of poems. And three of the four poems had been, people had accused these poems of transgressions in the real world. So there was a poem that had been accused of sexism, there's a poem that had been accused of racism, there's a poem that also had been accused of ableism, just sort of like the lefty moral transgressions. And then there was one poem that had been accused of nothing. And we gave these poems to our hundreds of readers, and the design was very simple. It was read the poem. We gave them 16 word choices, and we asked them to pick three words that they felt best described the poem. And they could also choose none of the above if they felt none of them were representative. So of those 16 words, we had moral words, like morally charged words, like racist, or this is progressive, or this is feminist, or anti-Semitic, or what have you. And then we just had a lot of aesthetic words, so beautiful poem, poorly written poem, things like that. And essentially, what we noticed was when we got the results back, you know, virtually no reader is accusing this poem of racism or sexism. Like, no one is reading these poems this way, even though among the sort of chattering class, this poem was, so slammed so hard for racism. This poem, How To, right, that the Nation published a patroonish apology letter among above the poem, just saying, we're so sorry for the harm we caused by publishing. And then you give it to readers, and it's like, 97% no one is clicking racist. Like, no one's reading it this way. So then the question became like, if generally speaking, people are not reading these poems the same way that the highly educated, very left of center chattering classes, is can we use social pressure to get them to read poems that way? So in our next sample, we recruited another random sample of a couple hundred people. Same thing, gave them the same poems. But this time we told them that at the end of the experiment, they may be asked to log into their Facebook accounts, at which point they would have a discussion of their choices, and their choices would be revealed to other participants. And we also, when we gave them the poems, we gave them a statement that was based off real criticism that I produced, and we attributed it to a literary critic. And the statement was very straightforward. It would say something like, this poem does enormous harm to the African American community for XYZ reasons, or this poem is so homophobic, it's whatever. And in this design sample, the number of people clicking racist, homophobic, ableist, it just shot up in every single example, even in the poem that no one had accused of anything in the real world. Is this poem called A Supermarket in California, written by Allen Ginsberg. It's an older poem. Ginsberg's actually sort of like a fave among the English leftists, is gay guy, Marxist. And even in that example, it was about 35% of people were agreeing with the fake criticism that I wrote, saying this is a deeply homophobic poem, right? So that data basically confirmed what I had suspected based off the innumerable number of interviews I had conducted with people in publishing at this point, which is that many of the people who sort of jump into the bandwagon and sort of get involved in this, they're people who are probably doing this to fit in. Another explanation is that when they see like a famous literary critic accuse a poem of something or a novel, they're kind of like, oh, this is sort of like the expert. Let's jump on with them. But the point being, like, is if we can sway the numbers that dramatically with just like a little bit of this artificial social pressure we created in our lab, what's going on in the real world where the pressure is so much higher, where the pressure of like, say an English PhD on the academic job market, who instead of joining the herd and saying, whatever, this op-ed is so offensive, it needs to be retracted, or this book is so racist, and who instead says, I don't think it's a racist book. Like what goes on in that situation. I remember very distinctly being on the phone with a woman who's been in the game for decades. I would consider her one of the foremost literary agents. Uh, and she was telling me one of her own authors sort of got accused of some stuff. And she had a friend of hers also in the publishing world who was like, what is happening to your author right now is just, it's so baseless. It's so this, it's so, there's nothing to it. And then she said she saw her friends then post and like one of the attacks on her author. And she said, what is that about? And her friend said, if I don't speak up in this, they're going to point at me for saying, I'm an enabler. I'm someone who's, just standing by as racist books are published and things like that. And what I remember most about that conversation is this agent I was talking to. She said, my friend is someone who's like a very outspoken, sort of like spine upright person. Like, this was not someone who I would just assume is just sort of like going along to get along, but that was the case. And I mean, having talked to so many people, I mean, the examples are just countless, right? Even down to the level of being in a room at one of these publishers, and your colleague at Penguin Random House is saying, we need to shut down the publication of 12 More Rules for Life by Jordan Peterson. Like, this is going to cause real harm in the world. And you yourself listening and saying, that's insane, that we would stop the publication. Insane for a number of reasons. You can ethical reasons, economic reasons. Peterson makes a lot of money. But sitting there and being like, I am not going to speak up about this because the last thing I need is these people in this office calling me a turf when I come in on Tuesday morning, you know? So I mean, this is the dynamic that's shaping again everything from picture books to what you see in Barnes and Noble, the adult nonfiction section.
Well put. Kind of the main character of that book is dangerous in a lot of ways is the unnamed sensitivity reader. And I wonder if you could give a few minutes maybe to talking about how that model came into being, what the real world problems the industry was trying to solve that ultimately led them to impose this kind of model, and then some of the challenges that the model has presented and why my sense at least is why the industry sticks with this model despite the fact that it often doesn't seem to be working all that well for the people it's trying to help. And when word of it gets out, it seems to be pretty unpopular with a lot of the public. So I'd love to hear you walk us through kind of the rise of that model and how it's gotten entrenched in the publishing world's culture.
Sure. So to give this the most generous rating possible, right? There's no disputing the fact that in the history of American literature, you can point to examples of writers writing outside their own identity who write about people who they don't share demographic characteristics with in ways that are very Tolkienish, in ways that are condescending, even when they make a valiant attempt to get it right. So you can go back to W.B. Du Bois when he started his children's magazine, and he did that because he was like, I want positive stories about young African American kids, and there's not a lot of those. And frankly, when Joe White guy does it, like sometimes it doesn't always land, right? I don't think there's anyone who would dispute that. Um, Now, where sensitivity readers come in is publishers basically faced a conundrum right around the time that social media really became this platform for debating and discussing books. So especially in like the early 2010s, when you have like Bookstagram, Book Talk, Book Twitter, these like really vibrant spaces of very online left of center people
Mhm.
who love talking and tweeting and gossiping about books. And what happened was there were a number of books that had been publicly criticized, in some places canceled. And a driving rationale for that was that, Peter Bonilla could never possibly understand what it's like to be a woman. And yet, Penguin Random House just published this novel about a woman, first person stream of consciousness. And then it was like, Peter gets this wrong, or, race probably being the most popular white person publishes a book. Maybe the secondary protagonist is African American or Asian American. All of a sudden, you have people saying they're getting it wrong, getting it wrong. And it solidified this idea that you on your own could never possibly understand someone who doesn't share your identity and characteristics, and this extended to gender, sex, sexuality, so on. So this became very codified very quickly. And there's one hashtag that was really helpful in terms of getting the publishers to implement this. It was this hashtag called own voices, right? So it was used in a very negative way. So like, this is not an own voices story. Like, F this book. It's Adam from Wisconsin. Like, what could he possibly write about a black character that is true? And then it became sort of a marketing thing, right? So you could go on Barnes and Noble in 2015, you could see the best 8 own voices books coming out in fall. So it quickly became intertwined with capital. And like, this is what publishers want, to the point where there was agents who would just de facto say, I'm not acquiring anything that is not own voices. If you're a man, write about men. If you're a woman, write about this. Now obviously, like there's a sort of number of holes in this logic. It's an incredibly reductive understanding of identity and art and so on and so forth, right? It's certainly no coincidence that many authors of color, authors who are not cisgender, authors from the quote unquote marginalized groups this is supposed to benefit have themselves pointed out like this is insane that, just because this guy is Asian that he can't write like a accurate, authentic African American character, what have you. Now the sensitivity readers, their origins, as I have come to understand them, is that they were first used in Christian publishers. So they would be brought on to sort of like read the books in terms of Christian values. But it's around 2015, 2016 that you actually start seeing the hashtag used online in a way that's aligned with like secular liberal values. So it'd be like, hey, I'm a white woman. I'm writing a story. I've got a secondary character who's trans. I'm not trans. Can I get a hashtag sensitivity reader? Hashtag sensitivity reader. Around this time, there was a sensitivity reader who created a database of sensitivity readers, and all of a sudden, you started seeing sensitivity readers getting like interviewed by the New York Times, interviewed by Katie Couric, in ways that were not. These were not critical interviews. This was like America's having a racial awakening, an awakening about identity and what have you. And sensitivity readers are sort of like at the vanguard of this within publishing. Um, Now, to be a sensitivity reader, there's no, you don't go to school, you don't take a seminar or what have you. It really is just sharing a demographic characteristic with a character in a book. So, like, if I was black, I could be a sensitivity reader for a black man. If I was trans, I could be a sensitivity reader for a trans character, so on and so forth. So, again, like, this really gets heavy in children's and YA. And then it gets to the point where I'm on the phone with agents, with senior editors who are talking about, oh no, this is in the world of adult nonfiction. This is in the world of adult fiction, and they're using the same sort of rationale, right? This is, certain peer-reviewed publications. Like if I remember correctly, I think Science, it got leaked that they were bringing in sensitivity readers to evaluate manuscripts. Um, so that's sort of what was going on, and right now, sensitivity readers still used by the publishing houses. I mean, you just type in sensitivity reader on Google, you'll find people selling sensitivity reader services, so on and so forth. The identity categories themselves get quite granular. So it's everything from I'm a sensitivity reader for the African American experience, like whatever that is supposed to mean, to I'm a sensitivity reader for half Latino queer. And I've had these conversations with, a number of people, everyone from Coleman Hughes to, colleagues of color. And, there's this underlying sense of how could any person evaluate a fictional book for its authenticity related to millions of people, right? So, like, I know Black people who are conservatives. I know Black people who voted for Bernie Sanders. I know Black people who eat quote unquote traditional African American food. I know Black people who don't do that, right? And one thing you'll notice with these sensitivity readers, some of whom I interviewed, is they have sort of declared themselves sort of the authentic voices of what is true, what is isn't, what is accurate, what is inaccurate, what foods you're supposed to eat if you're Black, not Black. And in many ways, the absolutely ironic effect of all of this is that a lot of the books that have been given a pass in recent years are books that are own voices books that often just recreate like the worst stereotypes about Black communities, about Chinatown, about what have you. The sort of stuff where if Joe White guy wrote, The Hate You Give. I mean, there's 0% chance that would ever see the light of day. And on the astronomically unlikely chance that it somehow did, I mean, this book would be quite literally burned in the same way you can find TikTok videos of liberals burning Harry Potter because it's that phobic and what have you. So this has not gone unnoticed by people, and there's definitely been pushback even within liberal circles. But sensitivity readers basically solve the problem of we can't just stop publishing like white people who have non-white people in their books, right? And we can't tell a white person like you can only have white characters in your book because then that's going to get accused of racism. At the same time, if you start writing brown characters, trans characters, you're going to get accused of writing outside your own identity. So like the sensitivity reader was essentially a compromise formation that allowed the non-trans writer to have the trans character that allowed the white guy to have the black character. And to be a bit more cynical, like I think they have functioned as a kind of disaster insurance. I don't think it's incidental that now when you read, especially YA fiction, you can read the acknowledgement section and it almost looks like PR copy where they'll say, "Oh, I'm so in debt to this sensitivity reader for working on this sensitivity reader for that," and it's basically trying to like get ahead of the curve and saying like, "Oh no, I've gotten approval," right? It is kind of like a more elaborate aesthetic way of saying like, "Oh, I have many black friends, so even though I'm white and I'm writing outside my identity and so on and so forth, this has the stamp of approval."
It's funny. My first job out of college, I've never worked in publishing, but my first job out of college was as the literary manager of a small theater company in Philadelphia. And to reduce it to its barest essentials, a literary manager is in a lot of ways a script reader. You scout what's going on in theaters around the country. You hopefully help cultivate new works and new writers, and you read a lot of the junk that comes in over the transom. And there, we didn't consider ourselves sensitivity readers or cultural competency experts, but at some point that becomes a little part of a bit of a part of the job, especially if you are, um, if you're seriously thinking about putting a work into production, and then you have to really drill down into the language. You really have to examine the characters' motivations. You have to see if the world that they've built for themselves succeeds on the terms it sets out for itself. And 17 or 18 years ago, when I was doing this, it was one of the most fun jobs in the world, even though it paid peanuts. And I'm sure it has now become, for a lot of the reasons you've just been discussing, a lot more fraught and a lot less enjoyable for the writers and also for the literary managers and dramaturgs. Okay, we're about halfway into our time. I just want to remind people again that if they have any questions to add to the discussion, they can write them into the chat. While we wait for those to come in, Adam, another question. You've had going on a year now since the book has been out. For it to get feedback, for you to see how the reception has been, and maybe also for it to jog loose some more insights from people in the industry, from people who see this industry up close. I'm curious to know. What some of the most interesting, what some of the most useful feedbacks or critiques that you've gotten to the work have been?
Yeah, so I would say if this book had come out in 2020, for example, I think the reviews would have been a lot harsher, for sure. I mean,
Hmm.
reviews are something I actually talk about in the book. Reviews have been canceled and retracted and edited and so on and so forth. But I think within the liberal media book spheres, there's been increasingly a conversation about what is going on in these spheres, right? So like my favorite review was in the Washington Post by Charles, I forget the guy's last name, has been doing reviews for like decades. And he kind of begins his review. He's like, there's this problem within book culture, and we've kind of been treating it like, our grandma who shoplifts occasionally. Like we've just all been sort of like turning a blind eye and like, let's not talk about this. But like the problem is what leftists are doing to books. So that's been pretty cool. I mean, it's been cool to see my book, reviewed positively in places that I wasn't sure would be positively reviewed in. The Nation, for example. So that's been cool. I've had some reviews like trashing me, some of which trash me for the reasons that I sort of outline in the book. Like, a review mentions the fact that I'm cisgender, as if that's relevant to the conclusions, or the accuracy of the conclusions. But that aside, I mean, I would say the most interesting thing that the response has prompted me to think about, which I'm kind of working on a magazine article right now about, is that gender seems to be a big part of this story, or at least a part of the story. And gender is not something I talk about in my book, but my book is about how publishing has changed quite radically, especially in the age of social media, right? But
Mhm.
another thing that has changed quite radically, especially in the past couple decades, is the gender makeup of publishing. So you go back to the early days, and it was a men's game. It sounds funny to say now, but like back in the day, it was a very masculine thing to work in publishing, to be an author. I mean, this is like the image of Hemingway, boxing on Tuesday, getting drunk on Wednesday, and like working on a novel on
Mhm.
Thursday. Or you have the agents like Andrew the Jackal Wiley coming up, and so but now it's like if you go to a typical publisher, it's probably going to be like a woman from Vassar College who finds it deeply problematic that their publisher is publishing like Chuck Palahniuk or something like that. It's a very different thing, and I'm not sure how to sort of explain the effects of that, but it does seem relevant that I've gotten many emails from readers and other colleagues and other people at this point who talk about, I'm a mother of a 13-year-old and 15-year-old boy, and they hate reading. Like they do not like the fiction that's coming out. I cannot get them to open anything. Um, and I think me personally, like I really can't think of any novel that's been published in the past decade that I was super excited about. And I know for a fact some of my favorite authors, because I've met them and I've talked to them about this. People like Chuck Palahniuk, Fight Club, who gave me that severed arm up there.
Mhm.
Uh, Bret Easton Ellis, who wrote American Psycho in the 90s, and like this big book. Like those sorts of people have themselves said, like, I would not be publishing books today unless I had gotten grandfathered in like 2 decades ago and I've proved profitable. But like the idea that the next Chuck Palahniuk is going to be doing a debut novel like that is pretty unlikely. And you know, the funniest part is that if I were to use their own arguments, the people who I sort of criticize pretty significantly in my book, their own arguments are like, identity is so important to how publishing is run and who gets acquired and stuff. So it's like they'll say, why are relatively few books by African Americans being acquired? And they'll say it's mostly white people. Why are so few books by whatever trans authors being acquired? Or why are books being this way? And then it's like when you zoom out and look at the data, the most glaring fact is that like 75% of publishing, from the level of agents to interns to presidents, is women. It's mostly women, especially at the big five publishers, is mostly middle to upper class white women who live in New York City, which is a extremely interesting sort of demographic shift, and one that I've been thinking about a lot. But I wouldn't say I'd be able to quite articulate how that fits into my book, and its arguments, but it's definitely relevant for sure.
Another thing we've touched on a couple of times is the influence of social media, especially when campaigns against some of these offending books gets ignited. And I've got two questions, and this first one is going to out me as someone who has never, who really does not use Instagram very much, or at least not for the purposes that it originally came out for, and someone who has never had TikTok on his phone, doesn't have an account, has never posted, hardly ever sees them, but I know that. That book talkers have, or it's easy to make jokes, but they have a real influence. They really can move the market, and that's something that has changed that has changed dramatically in the last generation of publishing. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about just how the economics have changed. The kind of decline of the traditional retail model. The factors that got us into the place where even when they can be raining hell down on you for for
Hmm.
crossing them politically, you kind of are in a place where you need the influencers for better and worse. So could you talk a little bit about how that model has changed?
Yeah, so I mean, back in the day, if you got your book reviewed in the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times Book Review, that was enough to move the needle. When you're talking nonfiction or fiction, like that was enough, right? Even in more recent history, right? You can and I've looked at the numbers for this. Like there was a period where if you were an author and you got booked on Joe Rogan, like you could count on thousands of sales because of that appearance, right? Where I've looked at more recent numbers from the past year, 5 copies sold because of an appearance on Rogan, like in live time, right? Um, so one thing publishers are doing, right, is they're looking at where are the people who are like obsessed with reading and books and where are they located? Because they have the money, they have the interest, and it really is these, especially in fiction, these sort of pockets. So we call them bookstagram or book talk,
Hmm.
but it's like people who are super into uh romance fiction. People are super into horror fiction, right? And they're on there, they're aware of like the upcoming books. There's channels that have hundreds of thousands of subscribers of people who are like, here's this latest book, I'm gonna talk about it, blah, blah, blah. Um, Publishers have understood this and really, really started to understand the past few years. So now it's at the point where, like, if you're an editor, especially if you're on the publicity side, like you're familiar with who's the big books influencers in your space. Again, whether your space is romance or horror, I mean, it's very genre fiction focused. But the point is like let's get those people advanced reading copies. Like, let's
Hmm.
do nice stuff for them so they can center our books. And it kind of comes back to like the advertising principle of like 1,000 true fans, right? So yeah, Joe Rogan has, he still has the most listened to podcast in the world, but how many people are like downloading that podcast to buy a book? Whereas if you can go into a space of someone who say has 5,000 YouTube subscribers, but those are like big book buyers, big buyers of like this particular kind of literature, like let's focus on that. Let's invest in that, right? But the flip side of that is, as my book is focused on, is not everyone is online to promote books they love and enjoy and want to share that. There's a much nastier side to this, and the publishers are also aware of that. And that's why you have people at like these huge conglomerates essentially trying to get on the good side of a YouTuber with 7,000 subscribers.
In terms of the various social media platforms, are would you say the kind of the visual platforms, the YouTubes, the TikToks, the Instagrams are more important and influential these days than maybe Twitter a handful of years ago when it was so effective at mobilizing opinion? I say this because, one of the changes in social media that has happened really kind of like probably in the time since you started writing this book and since it was published is, Twitter has become a much more fractured marketplace because,
Right.
Elon Musk purchased it. A lot of the more left-leaning users went to other platforms such as Blue Sky, um, which really didn't take off in terms of being able to challenge Twitter's market share for a time, but in the end, not really. And, what I've seen from a number of other commentators is the fact that this community kind of self-marginalized itself, made it easier for politicians and for stakeholders in maybe other cultural institutions to not pay as much attention to them when in previous years they would have had no choice but to kind of bend the knee a little bit. Have you seen that in kind of in the publishing world, and does that really matter while TikTok and other platforms remain as popular as they are?
Yeah, it's a good point. I think it's, from my vantage point, very genre contingent. So I think if my goal is to, get this fantasy book we're publishing on the New York Times bestseller list, I think Instagram and TikTok are the spots for that. I think there's a very vibrant landscape of people who want to read fantasy and romance fantasy, and like you want to meet those people where they are, and like you alluded to the visual component, right? So like it's at the point right now where you have big channels on these platforms who will create their custom book covers and things like that. There's also a huge gender component to this. I mean, it's especially when you're talking about fiction, it's almost entirely women who are sort of like governing this area. Now, on the flip side, though, if I, for example, wanted to try to wage a cancellation campaign against a nonfiction book that Penguin's publishing or Harper or what have you, I think X is probably still the place to do that. Um, that's historically where these cancellation campaigns have come from. It's my sense that X is still useful in that way. But if you want to promote a book, I would not put X at the top of that list.
Would I be right in saying that, with your book coming out from an academic press and not one of the big five publishers, you had a more, when it came time to promote the book, you had a more kind of traditional, um, a more sort of traditional promotional campaign. I haven't done this, so I really don't know what it looks like, but I'm curious. Like the publishing model has changed from the big five on down in so many ways. I'm kind of curious to know sort of what you had to do when you were getting it out there.
Yeah, so I would say so MIT, like my book in particular, which is like a crossover book. They feel it has trade book potential and not just academic potential. So like
Hmm.
MIT's distributor is Penguin Random House. So like
Yes.
my people at MIT will be in conversation with the people at Penguin, and you can buy my book on Penguin's website and so on and so forth. So it's not like an academic book in the sense that like there are certain academic presses that are not distributed by Big Five and really do like titles where if they sell 400 copies, like that's a great thing. For my book in particular, yeah, I would say the publicity effort was pretty typical for a nonfiction argumentative book in the sense like I have my people at MIT who have their connections to helping my book get attention in The Economist or C-SPAN or what have you. Like that, I mean, it was MIT is the reason I was literally talking about my book on C-SPAN and the reason I got
Hmm.
reviewed in like The Economist. On the flip side, though, like there's other things like the blurb economy, I would say is often more typically the author. So it's MIT didn't email Steve Pinker. That was, me who got Steve. I got all my blurbs on the back of my book. That's often how it is, right? So, and it's also like I've done a number of podcasts. That was me. That was my network. That was me
Hmm.
cold emailing people. So it's like that combination of things. And the point is like, in that situation, everyone's sort of just working cumulatively to try to get as many eyeballs on the book as possible. But again, this is like totally different if I'm writing summer romance fiction for Penguin Random House.
Sure.
That's a different game.
There's romance book talk for you, if you are.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. The romance books are fascinating to me
Actually up in
as a sociological phenomenon.
it's big enough business that actually up in Harvard Square there's a new bookstore that's just opened. I think it's in what used to be an old anthropology store
Hmm.
that is first and foremost focused on the romance. Uh, Godspeed to them. I want to see any bookstore on principle succeed. But
Yeah.
okay, a question we've had come in from one of our attendees is, we've been talking about this kind of the progressive grip on the culture, on the industry. have any viable workarounds emerged? Things like self-publishing. Are those able to, like are, there are more, there are more ways to get yourself out there. So I wonder, are there, do we have more ways around that model if you want to get your work out? Well, what are some of the smaller innovations that we might not be thinking about?
Yeah, so I ghostwrite a number of books every year. Some of those books are for famous people. Some of them are not for famous people.
Hmm.
When I'm working with a not famous person, I I have never encouraged anyone to self-publish. I've always worked with them to try to get them an agent and find a traditional publisher and stuff. For a number of different reasons. First and foremost, the economics of self-publishing, unless you're already a famous person with a platform and like your book's going to sell 6,000 copies or so, which is so few people. Um, the chances of you ever making any money off a self-published, especially a nonfiction book, or
Hmm.
even getting reviewed anywhere is so astronomically not in your favor. To say nothing of the fact you get no advance, so on and so forth, right? So, like when I'm ghostwriting for people, I'm also helping them get representation and so on, right? The reason is because like it's not just the quality of the book that determines the attention it gets and so on. It's the fact that MIT and Penguin Random House have distribution set up with Barnes and Noble so that when I walk into Barnes and Noble at the mall, 15 minutes from my house in Madison, Wisconsin, like I can literally see my book on the bookshelves. Like that book's not going to be on there if I self-publish that, right? So it's just like again, there's a extraordinarily small segment of people who already have a great platform, and it makes sense for them to self-publish a book and get all the profits and blah blah blah. But for like 99.999% of people, that's that it'd be the equivalent of me like uploading a PDF on a random website sort of thing.
Hmm.
Um, as far as like other publishers and sort of that thing, so I mean, I'm friends with Bernard Schweizer, who started Heresy Press a few
Yep.
years ago.
I'm
Um,
I'm gonna be having Bernard, I think, do this discussion a couple iterations down the road, and I've gotten to know him my last couple years in Cambridge as well.
yeah, yeah. So I mean, Bernard sort of started his publisher for the reasons outlined in this. We edited a book of fiction together that will be out next month that has some like really amazing authors in there. Chuck Palahniuk, David Sedaris, Joyce Carol Oates and stuff. And the thing was like we sort of were able to kind of like control the market for fiction that would probably perturb a lot of other publishers,
Hmm.
even when you have again like huge names like Joyce Carol Oates and other people. But again, I mean Bernard in his press, there's a few others that do something similar. They're competing against the big five publishing monolith, which especially in the case of fiction is like so hyper liberal. Um, Again, like the editor demographic is very homogenous, and it's not like young dudes on running that, right? So like it's very difficult to sort of like break into that and stuff. It's just like I can legally start an automobile manufacturer, but like the idea that all of a sudden people are going to be buying Adam Szetela's cars over Toyota, Honda, it's these publishers are very old. They have a near monopoly on the market. And especially in fiction, they're very afraid to publish certain things. Now, that said, like the current moment has created like certain opportunities for certain imprints and things like that, right? So like especially if you're a heterodox voice, controversial voice, but you're someone who like they trust is going to sell books, right? They'll publish Trump's kids, they'll do this, they'll more than happy to take Peterson on,
Hmm.
even when some of their staff protest, because like there's going to be money there. But I would say
Yeah.
it's like really hard outside of self-publishing to be like a novelist, for example, who's going to push buttons and irk people to like get a good book deal at like a good publisher. It's really hard. So.
Yeah. One more question from an attendee, and then I'm gonna give myself the last one. Moderator's privileges here, but
Sure.
question from one of our viewers: Are you aware of any recent situations where backlash against a book created a kind of Streisand effect, and the book became more popular or widely read because of the controversy? And surely I can do, a number of examples, especially as book bans have become more popular among conservative legislatures. But if you have any
Yeah.
particular examples that come to mind for you, I'd love to hear them.
Yeah, I'll tell you my favorite one. So, back when I was in high school, like 2008, 2009, 2010, 2011, there's a book called I Hope They Serve Beer in Hell by Tucker Max. It's a nonfiction book in which
Mhm.
Tucker regales his readers with stories of sexual intercourse and getting drunk and things like that. So Tucker was self-publishing those stories on his website because he could not find a publisher for them. Eventually, they get picked up by an agent, sell to a publisher. The book comes out. Now, as part of the publicity campaign for that book, possibly and or the movie on which it was based on, um, they started defacing billboards of I Hope They Serve Beer in Hell and doing it in a way that it appeared to be feminists who were angry. And then as a result of that, actual feminists started waging campaigns against the work. But the point is, like, this was Tucker, Ryan Holiday was involved in this, the Stoic guy now. And they were basically like, let's drum up fake negative attention because all attention is good attention. So I think in like more recent examples, right? I think like when you have someone like Andy No, the journalist who covers Antifa and has done it in a very polarizing way. Like when his book gets negative attention, I think it's great for him. Like it's he has his own audience and things like that. So it can definitely be good, right? But it's definitely not good when it is, say, a romance novel that gets accused of transphobia and like the book buying audience of romance novels is like heavily female. Online, it's very left of center, right? Like that's the sort of stuff like you don't want attached to your book. But if you're like a Peterson, for example, where like the fact that you're controversial is actually going to be appealing to some people and actually get you more attention and stuff, then it does work, that way.
Sure. Uh, Before I get to my question, a quick apology. People have been adding their questions in the Q&A, but I had the wrong privileges set on the chat, and people were not able to add their thoughts there. So I apologize to anyone who wasn't able to get in their thoughts that way. Um, but I wanted to give my last question, and it's kind of a multi-parter. I will try not to get lost in the asking. But and I'm going to use higher education as a point of comparison because I work in higher education related field, and I have watched how higher education's political fortunes have changed significantly in the last couple of years. And part of why they have changed so significantly is that, and why, Donald Trump was able to run kind of explicitly against higher education, among other things, in 2024 is that its worst excesses and its worst misdeeds were plastered, on newspaper front pages for months. After among other things the October 7th attacks, you had all these reports of lecture hall disruptions and building occupations and encampments that disrupted campus operations and police actions, and this really contributed to a sense among a lot of the population that higher education had lost its way. There were a lot of kind of big shining examples to point it towards, and now, there's a much less friendlier administration in Washington for higher education, and there has been a lot of troubling kind of coercive action, but with the new sheriff in town, the industry has, they have started started reforming some of their more divisive practices, getting rid of mandatory DEI trainings, mandatory DEI statements, and some universities disbanding bias response teams. Things that are good to see, despite maybe the means that by which they were achieved. And publishing by comparison, you have, there have been a surge in kind of, of book bans. There's been a lot of movement for that at the state house level around the country. But I think, the average American is a lot less interested in what goes into, they spend a lot less time thinking about what goes into the book that they might get at the airport on their way out of flight. I don't think they think as much about what goes into that, all the backroom discussions, all the kind of little censorship decisions that are taking place behind closed doors. And so, the model that we've been discussing, the model in your book with its reliance on sensitivity readers and its exposure to these kind of cancel campaigns, that remains, that seems to be pretty well intact, despite the fact that the landscape around them is very different from how it was. A few years ago, post George Floyd, that sort of social justice movement looked really difficult to beat. It looked like its gains were going to be around for a while, and the backlash came pretty quickly. And now it seems farther behind than it once was. And I've seen what happened to higher education and how it's adjusting. I'm not sure, if we think this model is unhealthy and has some toxic components that can stand to be reformed.
Right.
What I'm not sure what does that. And I'm wondering if you had any thoughts on it.
Yeah. So I'll note this, right? So I know a number of people in publishing, to this day, friends, colleagues, people I find interesting and stay in contact with. Um, there hasn't been any sort of like massive shift away from everything I talk about in my book. It's pretty consistent. I think some of the public cancel campaigns have sort of waned, right? But I would say publishing is very analogous to social science and humanities departments in the sense like, yes, in response to Trump's threats, like Cornell disbanded its DEI office and turned it into like a civic engagement office. Seems like it's basically doing the same thing. But the more important thing is like, I don't think there is a sober person in the room who would say Cornell English is now hiring moderates, and
Yeah.
it's not like Yale anthropology is now like this politically diverse. I actually think, having been around these people for a long time, when the right gets more political power and cracks down and things like that, these departments actually go even further to the left. So they're kind of like, Todd Gitlin wrote about this, like, we're not changing immigration policy or doing literally anything that affects ICE,
Hmm.
but we can keep ensuring like Cornell English is super left, super. I think that's super real. I think publishing is very similar. There's people in publishing who are like, we hate Trump, but can't do anything about Trump. I'm an editor at friggin' Simon and Schuster, right? But I can ensure we're not publishing any books that like might be contributing to Trumpism or what have you. Now, to your point, as to like the course correct, I mean, me personally, I see the only viable path, and there are hints of it somewhat, is that at the end of the day, like these are private companies, some of which
Hmm.
are heavily intertwined with private equity at this point. So if you take a risk and you publish, I got the book on my shelf over there, Notes on Being a Man by Scott Galloway, which is not a feminist like Yale professor take on being a man. It's certainly palatable enough to kind of like get through. But he says a lot of things in there that 5 years ago people would have been, burn this book. This guy's a misogynist. And from conversations I've had with agents and things, like, my own agent who was on the phone with recently, he was kind of telling me, he was like, the big five publishers have bought up some books about like men and masculinity and things like that. He's like, these are not. He's like, he basically said these are books that you would actually enjoy reading.
Hmm.
Which
Hmm.
that was not the case. If you in 2020, if you told me Penguin, Simon, these places are publishing books about men that I would want to read, and not just books that are like toxic masculinity, most progressive
Fair.
argument about it. So it's like, yeah, when Scott Galloway does a #1 New York Times bestseller and rakes in a ton of money and sort of creates the precedent for that, I think stuff like that, right?
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, like the most difficult barrier to overcome is the same one in humanities and social sciences departments in particular, which is like these are ideologically captured institutions that have been that way for years. They're incredibly politically homogenous, and everyone from, John Haidt on my bookshelf to all sorts of other folks, which shows that like when you get a group of people who are like very ideologically in sync with each other, extremism just sort of brews out of that. And it,
Sure.
it doesn't matter if you're talking about Harvard English or like the Westboro Baptist Church, right? Like that's what happens. So again, like I think publishing is going to continue to be like very left of center. It's going to continue to pull its next crop of editors and so on from the very places that are sort of like the cathedrals of cancel culture, like Harvard, so on. So yeah, I'm not, I want to be like naively optimistic about anything.
Well, I think with us being a few minutes past time, I appreciate you letting me drop that kind of question on you at 4:58 on in a 1 hour long discussion. Adam, again, thanks so much for coming on. For everyone who joined, that book is dangerous. It is out from the MIT Press. I encourage you to give it a read. I really enjoyed the read myself. I think there's a lot of value in there, and I think like some other books, you and I know have both read our Musa Al Garbi. We're both fans of We Have
Mhm.
Never Been Woke, and I think this is one of those books that kind of gives one of the keys to why certain incentives have set in and why they're expressed the way that they are. So I found a lot of value in it, and I hope those who tuned in will get their hands on it and do the same. So Adam, I just want to thank you for your time. Thanks for joining the MIT Free Speech Alliance. And yeah, best of luck with the book from here. And everyone, thanks so much for tuning in. It was great having you
Thank
all.
you. Thank you. It was an absolute honor. Thank you for everyone who came out today. I appreciate it.
Absolutely, Adam. Thanks, everyone, and have a great
Take
afternoon.
care.